No one in the border village of Thornridge noticed the young dragonling the first time it appeared, because it arrived quietly, without fire or thunder, gliding down at dusk to perch on the old stone wall behind a solitary human cottage at the edge of the fields. The cottage belonged to Aaron Vale, a widower known more for his silence than his strength, a man who had chosen the outskirts not for safety, but because grief made crowds unbearable. Aaron noticed the dragonling immediately. Of course, humans always notice dragons, but he did not reach for a weapon or raise an alarm. The creature was small, barely larger than a hunting hound, its scales a dull bronze rather than the blazing hues of war-bred dragons, its wings awkward and uneven like they had grown faster than the rest of it. It watched Aaron with cautious curiosity, golden eyes alert but not hostile, and when Aaron froze, unsure whether to run or speak, the dragonling tilted its head in a way so disarmingly familiar that it broke the tension like a cracked shell. Aaron did nothing. He returned to chopping wood, slow and deliberate, letting the rhythm of labor signal calm rather than challenge. After several minutes, the dragonling crept closer, sniffing the air, drawn by the scent of food and the steady heartbeat of a man who was afraid but not panicked. When Aaron finally glanced back, the dragonling flinched, wings half-spreading, and Aaron immediately looked away again, murmuring a quiet apology meant more for himself than the creature. That was how it began, not with fire or prophecy, but with mutual restraint. The dragonling returned the next day, and the day after that, always at dusk, always alone, never crossing the invisible boundary Aaron never named but always respected. Aaron began leaving scraps of cooked meat near the wall, not as bait, but because wasting food felt wrong when something hungry kept visiting. The dragonling accepted the offering cautiously, snatching pieces and retreating, until one evening it lingered long enough to eat within arm's reach, steam curling from its nostrils as it chewed. Aaron spoke to it then, not in commands or prayers, but in the same low voice he once used to calm frightened horses, telling it about the weather, the harvest, the way the hills changed color with the seasons. The dragonling did not understand the words, but it understood the tone, the absence of expectation. Weeks passed, and the visits became routine, a quiet agreement neither acknowledged aloud. The dragonling grew slightly larger, its wings stronger, its scales brighter, and Aaron noticed old scars along its flank, marks of teeth and talons that spoke of rejection rather than battle. It was a runt, Aaron realized, tolerated at best, driven away at worst, and the understanding settled into him with a familiar ache. He never tried to touch it. He never tried to keep it. He simply made space. Then one evening, the dragonling did not come. Aaron waited longer than usual, standing by the wall until the stars emerged and the cold crept into his bones, telling himself that this was normal, that wild creatures did not owe humans consistency. It did not come the next day either, or the one after that, and though Aaron told no one, something quiet and heavy returned to his chest, an old grief wearing a new shape. Life went on. Winter edged closer. Then, on a gray afternoon weeks later, the ground began to tremble. Not with the sharp violence of attack, but with layered weight, many bodies moving as one. Aaron stepped outside just as shadows spilled over the hills, and his breath caught as he saw them. Not one dragon, but dozens, gliding and walking in controlled formation. Their sizes and colors varied, their presence overwhelming. At their front flew the dragonling, no longer awkward, wings steady and strong, turning its head once to look back at Aaron as if to say, simply, come see. And in that moment, Aaron understood that whatever choice he had made in silence had not gone unnoticed, and that the small kindness he had offered without expectation was about to return to him magnified beyond anything the village, or the world, was prepared for. The village bells began ringing before the dragons reached the fields, because fear travels faster than understanding, and the people of Thornridge reacted the only way they knew how when shadows multiplied across the sky, by grabbing weapons, shouting warnings, and preparing for a disaster they believed inevitable. Aaron heard the bells and felt the old, instinctive pull to hide, but the sight of the young dragonling circling lower, slower, deliberately holding the pace of the herd, rooted him where he stood. He raised his hands, not in surrender, but in a silent plea for patience, though he knew most villagers would not see the difference. The herd landed beyond the outer fences, massive forms folding wings with practiced discipline. Their movements controlled and restrained in a way Aaron had never associated with dragons. The ground shook under their collective weight, yet no fire flared, no roar shattered the air. At the Dragonling's signal, a simple turn of its head, a short churring call, the herd settled, sitting or crouching, their attention fixed not on the village, but on the solitary humans standing by the wall. Murmurs spread among the villagers as they watched the impossible unfold. Dragons waiting. The Dragonling approached Aaron openly, lowering its head in a gesture that mirrored the quiet trust they had built over months, and Aaron, heart hammering, reached out for the first time, resting his palm briefly against warm scales before pulling back, careful not to overstep. The contact sent a ripple through the herd, a low, resonant hum that vibrated through the ground, not hostile, but acknowledging. When village guards advanced, weapons raised, the larger dragons shifted subtly, not attacking, but positioning themselves between the humans and Aaron, an unmistakable declaration of intent. The Dragonling lifted its head and released a clear, ringing call that cut through the tension, and Aaron understood, not in words but in certainty, that this was not a show of force, but protection. He turned to the villagers then, his voice carrying farther than he expected as he told them the truth, that the Dragonling had come alone, hungry and wounded, and that all he had done was refuse to treat it like a threat. The dragons did not deny his words. They reinforced them with stillness. Hours passed in a fragile standoff, until fear slowly gave way to awe, and weapons were lowered one by one. The herd remained until nightfall, silent sentinels under the stars, before lifting off in unison, leaving the fields unburned and the village forever changed. The days after the herd's visit unfolded with an unease that felt heavier than panic, because Thornridge had been spared destruction without understanding why, and uncertainty is often more frightening than fire. Messengers rode hard to nearby towns and keeps, carrying stories that sounded like madness even as they swore every word was true, while Aaron returned to his quiet routines under the weight of hundreds of eyes that now watched him with a mixture of suspicion and reluctant respect. He answered questions patiently, repeating the same simple truth until it lost its sharp edges. The Dragonling had never demanded anything, and neither had he. Yet the world beyond the village was slower to accept simplicity. Scouts reported dragon movements along the ridgelines, not raids but patrols, herds appearing and disappearing like living weather systems, always distant, always watchful. One evening, as the sun bled red into the hills, the young Dragonling returned alone, landing softly by the familiar stone wall as if nothing extraordinary had happened. Aaron felt a strange relief at the sight, the kind reserved for reunions that confirm you did not imagine what mattered. This time, the Dragonling stayed longer, curling near the cottage and watching Aaron work, its presence calm, almost contemplative. When Aaron spoke, he did not ask questions he could not answer. He spoke instead of the village's fear, of how easily humans mistook restraint for weakness, and the Dragonling listened, head tilted, eyes reflecting firelight and something deeper. Over the following weeks, other dragons came one by one, never together, never announced, observing Aaron from a distance, testing boundaries the way wary animals always do. He did not change his behavior for them. He did not offer more food or bow or beg. He treated each visit as he had treated the first, acknowledging presence without surrendering agency, and that consistency began to matter more than intention. Slowly, a pattern emerged that scholars would later argue over endlessly. The Dragonling was not leading the herd as a ruler, but as a proof. Dragons that had known only dominance and survival were watching a human who neither feared nor sought to control them, and they were recalibrating instincts older than memory. When a group of armored knights finally arrived, convinced that Thornridge was under some hidden threat, they found themselves halted not by fire, but by dragons positioning themselves between steel and that quiet cottage, making it clear without violence that this place was claimed not by conquest, but by choice. Aaron stood at the center of it all, painfully aware that he had never asked for influence, only peace, and yet influence had found him anyway. The realization settled slowly and irrevocably. The Dragonling had not brought the herd to impress or intimidate, but to show its kind that humans could be something other than enemies. and that sometimes the smallest bond was strong enough to shift the direction of an entire species. The turning point came not with another dramatic arrival, but with an absence, when weeks passed without a single dragon shadow crossing the fields, and the quiet around Aaron's cottage deepened into something expectant rather than lonely. Thornridge began to change in subtle ways as fear loosened its grip. Farmers worked farther from the village walls, travelers lingered instead of passing through at speed, and the bells that once rang at every distant wing beat fell silent, their ropes stiff with disuse. Aaron continued his life as he always had, mending tools and tending his small plot, yet he felt the weight of what had been set in motion pressing gently but persistently against his days. When the dragons returned, it was not as a herd but as a gathering, spreading themselves across the hills in clear view, neither hiding nor threatening, simply existing alongside human land. The young dragonling landed beside Aaron once more, larger now, its scars faded but still visible, and for the first time it spoke. Not in words, but in a shared understanding that settled into Aaron's mind like a memory he had always owned. It showed him images of dragon herds fractured by fear, of constant competition that left the weakest behind, and of how his quiet acceptance had revealed an alternative none of them had considered. Aaron realized then that the dragonling had not returned with others out of loyalty alone, but out of responsibility, carrying proof that gentleness did not invite destruction. Over time, limited contact became tradition. Selected humans were allowed near dragonlands under watch, and dragons were permitted to rest near villages without provoking alarm. There were setbacks. Moments when old instincts flared, when fire scorched earth or arrows flew in panic. But each time, memory intervened, the image of a lone human standing calmly by a stone wall anchoring restraint on both sides. Aaron aged as the world adjusted around him, never crowned, never celebrated beyond quiet respect, but known everywhere as the man the dragons listened to. When his steps finally slowed and his hands trembled, the dragonling, now grown into a formidable presence, returned with others not to claim land or demand tribute, but to stand watch as Aaron rested, ensuring that no fear would touch him in his final days. And when he passed, the dragons remained, their silhouettes etched against the sky in silent vigil, marking not the end of a life, but the beginning of a truth that would outlive them all. That coexistence did not begin with treaties or power, but with one human who chose patience when fear would have been easier. What followed Aaron's passing was not an ending but a diffusion, like warmth spreading outward long after the fire itself had gone cold, because the dragons did not leave Thornridge when their vigil ended, nor did they claim it as sacred ground. They simply allowed it to remain open, unclaimed, a place defined by memory rather than ownership. The young dragonling, now fully grown and bearing the quiet authority of one who had led without force, took to ranging far beyond the hills, guiding herds across borders that had once been lines of death, and wherever they went, humans noticed the same pattern repeating. Dragons pausing near farms without burning them, settlements spared not by fear but by recognition, travelers finding themselves watched from above without being hunted. Stories spread, not polished or heroic, but stubbornly consistent, all tracing back to a single human who had never tried to matter. Thornridge became a reference point in disputes, invoked not as proof of dragon mercy, but of human capacity, and when councils debated whether coexistence was possible, someone would always ask the same quiet question. If it worked there, why not here? Over time, customs formed on both sides, unspoken but understood. Humans left spaces unfortified near wild lands, and dragons respected them. Lanterns burned at dusk not as warnings, but as signals of welcome without obligation. The dragonling visited Aaron's grave only once, lowering her massive head until it rested against the stone, not in mourning but acknowledgement, before lifting into the sky and never returning again, her task complete. Generations later, children would still ask why dragons no longer came as conquerors, and elders would tell them that the world had learned something difficult and rare, that dominance was loud but fragile, while restraint endured. And among dragons, whose memory was long and exacting, Aaron Vale was not remembered as a hero or a master, but as a fixed point, a human who proved that strength did not require command, only consistency, and that sometimes an entire herd will follow not the one who roars the loudest, but the one who stood quietly and did not turn away. Long after Thornridge had faded from maps into something scholars argued over rather than visited, The effect of one quiet human's patience continued to shape the instincts of creatures who had once known only hierarchy and fire. The dragon herds still moved as living weather across the world, but their paths bent away from needless destruction, guided by inherited memory rather than command. A memory that began with a stone wall, a widower's grief, and a refusal to answer fear with violence. Young dragons were no longer taught solely through dominance and trial by flame. They were taught stories first, shown what restraint looked like in practice, told of the human who neither fed nor fled instinctively, but chose presence over power. Humans, too, carried the lesson forward in quieter ways, building border villages with open spaces instead of kill zones, teaching children to read the sky rather than curse it, to recognize when something vast was observing rather than hunting. There were still wars, still moments when fire answered steel, because no lesson ever erases nature entirely. But when those moments came, both sides remembered that another outcome was possible, because it had already happened once. In the long view of dragon history, Aaron Vale became a measure rather than a myth, a reference against which future choices were weighed. Would this action bring fear, or would it invite understanding? And in the rare moments when a young dragon strayed alone toward human lands, driven by hunger, curiosity, or exile, elders did not roar warnings or loose flame. They watched, waiting to see whether the human it encountered would become another Aaron, or whether the world would have to relearn the lesson the hard way. Thus the age of endless hostility did not end with a declaration, but with a standard quietly set and stubbornly remembered, proving that HFY was never about humans being the strongest, but about being the ones who chose to stand still, to make space, and in doing so taught even dragons how to follow. The final chapter of that long, unremarkable miracle revealed itself only when the world was tested again, generations later, by a crisis that would have once ended in ash without debate, when a young dragon herd, new, restless, and untempered by memory alone, wandered too close to a densely populated human region and fear surged fast enough to drown wisdom. Armies mobilized, mages argued for preemptive strikes, and old voices insisted that restraint was a luxury history could no longer afford. Yet before the first order could be given, a single dragon broke formation and descended alone toward the human lands, not roaring, not threatening, but circling low with deliberate care. Elders on both sides recognized the gesture instantly, though none could have explained why, and somewhere deep in shared memory a name surfaced without being spoken. A lone human stepped forward to meet the dragon. Not a hero chosen by prophecy, not a ruler or general, but a farmer's daughter who had grown up hearing the old stories and believed them enough to stand still when fear told her to run. She did not know Aaron Vale beyond legend, yet she repeated his choice as naturally as breathing, setting down her tools, opening her hands, and making space. The dragon landed, hesitant, watching her with the same cautious curiosity that had once flickered in bronze-gold eyes by a stone wall, and the watching world held its breath as the old pattern threatened to repeat itself. When nothing burned, when no blade was drawn, the tension broke not with triumph but with relief so profound it echoed across species. And the elders understood at last that Aaron's legacy had crossed the threshold from memory into instinct. The crisis dissolved without battle, armies standing down not because they were ordered to, but because they no longer believed annihilation was inevitable. And so the story completed its arc, not by proving that humans could command dragons, nor that dragons could be tamed, but by showing that one quiet act of patience had rewritten expectations deeply enough to outlive its originator. In the end, HFY was never about humans standing above others, but about standing firm in the smallest moments, trusting that kindness remembered is stronger than fear inherited, and that even herds of fire will one day follow the example set by a single human who chose not to turn away. The last ripple of that choice appeared so gently that no one recognized it as an ending, only as the way the world now worked, when coexistence stopped being remarkable and became mundane, woven into daily life the way seasons once were. Dragons no longer gathered in herds to make statements, and humans no longer needed symbols to feel safe. Instead, understanding lived in habits, in pauses before action, in the expectation that restraint was always an option. Trade routes crossed beneath familiar shadows, children waved at passing wings without awe or fear, and elders told the old stories not as warnings but as origins, explaining why things were the way they were rather than why they might end. Scholars eventually traced the shift not to councils or reforms, but to repetition, The same quiet choice made again and again by ordinary people who believed the stories enough to act like them. Dragons, whose memories were long but not immutable, found that even their instincts had softened, no longer urging dominance at every uncertainty, but offering curiosity first, because curiosity had once saved an entire species from endless war. In distant lands where neither Thornridge nor Aran Vale were remembered by name, the pattern still held. Lone dragons approached carefully, lone humans responded with steadiness, and conflict dissolved before it could define the moment. The world did not become perfect, but it became survivable in a way it never had been before, because expectation had changed. And if one listened closely, beyond the noise of markets and the rush of time, one could almost hear it, the echo of a choice made long ago, still guiding fire and flesh alike, reminding both that power was never the point, only what you chose to do when you had it.